Hi, friend. I'm so glad that you're here for this chat with Ash. You're invited to join me in striving to better know and love God, walk in light of being known and loved by Him, and to make Him known as we share our stories. Some of ours are harder to share than others, but there's hope and beauty in every story because of the author who is doing a great work in and around us every day. Hi friends, welcome back to another chat with Ash. If you are new here, welcome. I'm your host, I'm Ashley. I really hope that this space is a place that just encourages you and challenges you. And if it does, would you take a moment to invite others to the table by liking and sharing the episodes that God has used in your life? Also, if you're on YouTube, you can subscribe to my channel and then you'll get notifications anytime there's something new posted. I want to talk today about storytelling. You've probably caught on that telling our stories is a topic that comes up often for me. It's even in the intro. I acknowledge that some of our stories are harder to tell than others. I also have a quote that I say often, and it's that when we tell our stories, we reveal the author of our stories and how he's made all the difference. My question, though, today is, should we always tell our story? Is there ever a time in which maybe being silent is what we need to do? The answer to that is yes. Yes, there is a time for silence, and there's also a need for wisdom and discernment when we tell our stories. So let's talk about that a little bit. But before we do, have you noticed that there's something about a good story? What is it that makes a good story? My answer to that, and I'd be really curious to know yours, but my answer to that is how a good story connects us. A good story, I think, is a reflection of the Creator and how He has made us to be in community. And so when we hear a good story, it's that moment that just draws us in, and it makes us go, you too? I mean, have you noticed even in, I'll just pick on Chronicles of Narnia, even in something that is fiction, something that is so out of this world that there are elements of the story that you know you're never going to see or experience here, there's still things, it's as if those things still reveal what is true. And it's that connection through fiction even that reveals who God is, that reveals something about what it is to be human, just different experiences that we have that connect us to each other. It's part of what makes a good story. And that's part of why it is so important that we share our stories, because they connect us. But like I said, I mean, there is a time for silence. And I want to acknowledge that with you. I'm going to pick on my own life just to make it hopefully a little more comfortable for you. But I will acknowledge that there are parts of my story that are between God and me. There are decisions that I've made in the past. There are things that I have experienced that I haven't been willing or able to share with anyone else. There are details of experiences that I have chosen to keep between God and I. Now those, I will admit, those experiences and details are few because I'm a word person. Speaking and sharing is just a part of my DNA and how God has wired me. But even for someone like me who loves words and who loves sharing, not everything that I've experienced needs to be on the table for everybody else to see. And that's okay. God is the one that knows all and sees all. And there are some things that I only trust Him with. But I think the key in those areas of our story that need to be more private, I think the key is just recognizing that our heart needs to be willing. If God ever asks me to share with anyone some of those things that I have kept between God and me, some of those details that are sacred to me, I need to be willing to act in obedience if He asks me to. I really hope He doesn't. But it's just that posture of willingness that I think we need to keep on the table when it comes to the areas in which we choose to be silent. When it comes to relationships, I heard this great analogy once. There was a man talking to us, and he was saying, our life is kind of like a bullseye. There are the outer circles that work their way to the center. And if you imagine you standing on the center of that bullseye, you might look at relationships and say, okay, there are a few people I am so close to. They stand in the center with me. And there are other people that I'm still very close to, but they're on an outer ring, and so on. And so when it comes to sharing, I often think about that picture of the bullseye. There are some people that I am so close to and that I trust so much that I would tell anything or almost anything. There are others that I still trust, but they're on the outer circles. And then there are some that it's like, I could share this story with them, but I wouldn't share that story because I just don't have the relationship. I don't have the trust there. And I think that's just a normal part of life. But I also think it's a reflection of the need to be discerning and the need to practice wisdom in what we share and with who we share with. In Ecclesiastes 3, it's a really familiar passage. It's the one that says there's a time for everything. I never noticed it until I was looking this up recently because I was thinking about an area in my life in which God has asked me to be silent. And I was questioning, is it really okay for me to be silent? I mean, for like over 2 years now in this area, when I have prayed about speaking, because I've got words. God has answered multiple times in the same way. Be still, be silent, wait on the Lord. And I kind of wanted to argue with God about that. Like, are you sure? Because like I mentioned, I have words. I have some things that I could say. And yet in this verse, in chapter 3, verse 7, it says that there's a time to keep silence and there's a time to speak. There's time for both. And so part of being a good storyteller is knowing sometimes we have to be silent and we have to be still and we have to trust the author that he is doing something, that he is working, that he is speaking. And our job is to be still. Oh, it's so hard, at least for me. So difficult. But sometimes even silence can speak. Sometimes silence communicates. Sometimes that's negative. There are times when we're silent and we shouldn't be. There are times when we use our silence as a way to wound others that should not be. But sometimes silence is necessary. Sometimes silence is healing. Sometimes silence is saying, let me get out of the way, God, so that you can do what you need to do. And at least for me over the last few years, that is what I hope and think has been happening. God has just needed me to get out of the way. But also in the silence, I'm learning sometimes silence is a grace that God gives. Sometimes it's like a form of protection. Because as I mentioned, I have words, but that doesn't mean that speaking them would have been beneficial. And so I think God's protection over me in this area has been be silent. There's nothing to regret for me in the silence in this area. So those are just some thoughts I have about the silence. But when we are asked to share, the question is, what should I share? Again, discernment with knowing your audience, being aware of who you can trust. I think also part of knowing your audience is this something that they should and are willing to receive? And I'm going to pick on my kids right now, right? Just because they're here, just because I'm very close to them, doesn't mean that it's always appropriate for me to share with them, right? Because they're young, because they're my children. And so that's just an awareness that I constantly have to have. And then part of being aware of that is like, if I am supposed to share something, if I am supposed to speak, the way that I do that is really important based on the audience. I would tell, I might share a truth with the boys in a completely different way than I might share a truth with a close friend or with Eric. So you just have to be aware of that. But whether we're being silent or whether we're using words, I think we have to just be very mindful of the why. Why am I being silent, or why am I choosing to share? I recently had the opportunity to go to the Gerald R. Ford Museum in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and it was really fascinating for me because this is probably kind of embarrassing to say, but I really didn't know very much about him at all, and I certainly didn't know very much about his wife, but they had an entire section dedicated to Betty Ford, and I was immediately drawn to it because there were so many beautiful dresses on display. I'm going to do a rabbit trail real quick because I wouldn't say that I'm an extremely fashionable person, but I do think I was born in the wrong era when it comes to fashion. I don't know what is happening with clothes lately. Ladies, if you have younger kids listening, close their ears for a second because here's my perception. There are two extremes to choose from right now. You've got the 1990s street worker look, or you have the prairie girl, I'm going to wear a pinafore for a dress. What? No. If you have any influence over fashion, could you please take this note? I am over here waiting and hoping for the day when if we have to redo some fashion eras, let's do the 1940s or 50s. That would be so wonderful. I think that's when I was supposed to be born. Anyway, back to Betty Ford. These beautiful dresses caught my eye, so I went over to go look at them and I started reading about her life, and she was a fascinating woman. She had been placed in this really influential position, not necessarily something that she had foreseen coming, and yet she was very much human, and there were elements to her story. There were experiences that she was having that were not necessarily acceptable at the time to speak about. One of the first things I read about her was that she had breast cancer, and she was open about that, and she shared about that. She had a mastectomy. I mean, it was a brutal journey for her, and she shared publicly about her experience. Another element of her story that I was unaware of was she had some physical pain, and because of that pain, she was on medications that she became addicted to. And so a year or so after her husband left office, she was confronted. There was an intervention by her family doctors saying, you have a problem, you have a substance abuse problem. And she chose later down the road to make that public. The why behind her sharing different parts of her story that were not normal to share at the time, things that were really taboo to share, things that would have opened her up to other people's criticism and judgment. The why struck me immediately. Her heart was for helping others. She realized that she was not the only one to have those experiences. She realized that those walking through those difficult things needed a connection point. They needed someone to say, I've been there too, and I can help. And that is what our story should be as well. It's a connection point of saying, I'm sharing not to make much of myself, not to tell you how awesome I am, not to have a pity party. I'm sharing because there's a good purpose. And that purpose, if we are believers, should be, I want to share with you how Jesus met me here. I want to share with you about this thing that happened, this thing that I experienced, this thing that I've struggled with, because I want you to understand you're not the only one. We talk so much in church and we talk so much as believers about how awesome God is and how great God is and how amazing His salvation is, but I think we often fail to share what's made Him so awesome. When we leave out our humanity, when we leave out our sin, when we leave out the biggest chunk of the story that makes the climax so significant, then we have failed to make much of God. Sometimes, the world will criticize us as believers and say, well, you're just a bunch of hypocrites. And I always think that's fair. Many times we are. And it's not even necessarily we're hypocrites because we haven't shared all of our stories. Sometimes it's just we're so busy only sharing the parts of the story that we're most comfortable with that we fail to make much of God. We fail to help the world understand or see, this is why I need Jesus. This is how he's made a difference in my life. And really part of the storytelling is keeping it present. I mean, it's not just, well, this thing happened to me once and God did this thing to me then. It's an ongoing, we're made of stories. Every day is part of that story. Until God calls us home, we are a living, breathing story that should make much of God. Not because we're so great, not because we're so perfect, we're not, but because he is. That's what makes our story so significant. That's what makes it worth sharing. That's what makes it worth the risk of somebody else looking at you or me and judging harshly or criticizing, because I don't have to be afraid of that, because it's not about me. It's not about you. So as we come to this table today and we're talking about sharing our stories, on the plate, what I see are three things: wisdom, discernment, and courage. As you think about your story and you think about the things that you've experienced with me, let's think about what I should share, what you should share. Let's think about the why. Why should I share? With whom should I share this? As the author Christy McLeland once wrote, we're not to be lakes, we're to be rivers. The things that happen, the things that we experience aren't meant to be held stagnant. We're supposed to be flowing. That word of God, those things that we experience walking with him, flowing from us to others for their benefit, to shine greatly for Christ. That's what's there, but we need the courage to do that. We need God to give us that courage and that boldness to know it's okay if somebody hears my story and they think, well, she's an idiot, or they judge harshly. It's okay, because the person that needs to hear it is worth the risk. If you think about your story and God is bringing something specific to share, and you find yourself feeling scared, it's okay. I know that fear very well. But I would encourage you to think about that faceless person that somewhere out there needs to hear that story. They need to know they're not alone. But most of all, they need to know there's hope. And that hope is in Jesus. And so I hope that will give you the courage and me the courage to, when God asks us to share, to do it with boldness. Friend, I hope you enjoyed our time together today. Author Christy McLeland once wrote that we want to live like rivers and not lakes. We want the word to travel to us, through us, and to others, and that we've only truly learned a thing when we can give it away. If God has used this episode to challenge and encourage you, would you consider inviting others to the table by liking and sharing this episode? It's my prayer that we will grow in boldness as we share our stories and reveal the author and how he has made all the difference.